Captain Elena Vasquez stepped off the military transport vessel onto the landing pad of New Geneva Station, her combat boots hitting the metal deck with a sound that echoed through the cavernous hangar. The familiar weight of her service medals clinked softly against her chest as she shouldered her gear bag. 3 years. 3 long years fighting the Catherian horde in the Outer Rim territories, and now she was finally home. The other passengers from the transport were already dispersing, most of them seasoned veterans like herself, their faces bearing the same 1,000-yard stare that came from watching too many friends die in the cold vacuum of space. Elena had commanded the 47th Orbital Strike Division through 17 major engagements, earned the Silver Star for galactic service, and held the record for the most successful boarding actions against Catherian dreadnoughts. But as she made her way through the busy corridors of the station, heading toward the civilian transport hub, she noticed the looks, the quick glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. She caught fragments of words floating through the air around her. Just a girl. Probably stayed in the rear with the supplies. Bet she never saw real action. Elena kept her expression neutral, her training keeping her emotions locked down tight. She had learned long ago not to react to such comments. Let them think what they wanted. The scars hidden beneath her uniform told a different story. The civilian transport to Earth was crowded with families, business people, and tourists. Elena found a seat near the back and settled in for the 6-hour journey to her home planet. She pulled out her personal tablet and began reviewing the messages that had accumulated during her deployment. Most were routine communications, updates from the military bureaucracy, and notifications about her awards and commendations. But one message caught her attention. It was from her younger brother Marcus, sent just 2 days ago. Elena, I know you're coming home soon. I wanted to warn you that things are different here. The war feels very far away on Earth. People don't really understand what you've been through out there. Some of the neighbors have been saying things. Mom tries to defend you, but you know how she is. She doesn't like confrontation. Dad's been quiet about the whole thing. I think he's proud, but he doesn't know how to show it. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that I believe in you. I've read the reports. I know what you did out there. See you soon. Marcus. Elena closed the tablet and leaned back in her seat, watching the stars streak past the viewport as the transport entered hyperspace. Marcus had always been the smart one in the family, 2 years younger but somehow wiser about how the world worked. If he was warning her about the reception she might receive at home, then things were probably worse than she had imagined. She thought about the last major battle she had fought, 3 months ago at the Kepler station. The Catherians had launched a massive assault on the mining facility, home to over 50,000 civilian workers and their families. Elena's division had been outnumbered 3-1, facing down enemy ships that were larger, faster, and better armed than anything humanity had in its arsenal. But the Catherians had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated human determination and ingenuity. Elena had devised a plan that involved using the station's mining equipment as improvised weapons, turning the industrial lasers and magnetic accelerators into defensive systems. Her soldiers had fought for 18 hours straight, using every trick in the book and inventing new ones on the fly. In the end, they had not only saved Kepler Station, but had captured 3 Catherian vessels intact, providing human intelligence with their first real look inside enemy technology. The victory had been so significant that it had changed the entire course of the war, forcing the Catherians to retreat from 3 star systems they had previously controlled. Elena had personally led the boarding action on the largest enemy ship, fighting her way through corridors filled with hostile aliens while her squad covered her advance. She had taken a plasma blast to the shoulder and kept fighting, using her combat knife when her rifle's power cell ran dry. When the smoke cleared, she had single-handedly secured the ship's command center and forced the surrender of the remaining crew. But none of that would matter to the people back home. All they would see was a young woman in a military uniform, someone who looked too small and delicate to have survived real combat. Elena was 26 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed 130 pounds. To most civilians, she looked like she should be teaching school or working in an office, not commanding a warship. The transport dropped out of hyperspace as they approached Earth's solar system, and Elena felt her heart rate increase slightly as she saw the blue and white marble of her home planet growing larger in the viewport. She had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining the hero's welcome she might receive, the parades and celebrations that would mark her return from the war. Instead, she found herself wondering if anyone would even believe her when she told them what she had accomplished. The docking procedure at Luna Base took another 2 hours, and then Elena caught a shuttle down to Earth's surface. She had grown up in the farming communities of the North American Agricultural Zone, in a small town called Millfield that was home to about 3,000 people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip traveled faster than light-speed communications, and where traditional gender roles were still strongly enforced, despite the technological advances of the 24th century. As the shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, Elena could see the familiar patterns of farmland spreading out below her. The automated agricultural systems worked around the clock, tending crops and livestock with mechanical precision. It was peaceful, orderly, and completely removed from the chaos and violence of the war zone she had called home for the past 3 years. The shuttle landed at the regional transport hub, and Elena caught a ground vehicle for the final leg of her journey home. The driver, an elderly man with weathered hands and a friendly smile, tried to make conversation as they drove through the countryside. "Coming home from the military, are you?" he asked, noticing her uniform. "Yes, sir," Elena replied politely. 3-year deployment in the Outer Rim." The driver chuckled and shook his head. "Well, I'm sure it wasn't too rough out there. They probably kept you nice and safe, being a young lady and all. Good thing, too. War's no place for someone like you." Elena bit back her first response and simply nodded. "I was fortunate," she said quietly. "Oh, I'm sure you were," the driver continued. "Probably had you doing communications or medical work, something suitable. My granddaughter is about your age and she's thinking about joining up. I keep telling her she should stick to the safe positions. Let the men do the dangerous stuff. That's just how it should be, you know?" Elena spent the rest of the ride in silence, watching the familiar landscape of her childhood roll past the window. The farming equipment moved through the fields like mechanical ballet dancers, harvesting crops and preparing the soil for the next planting cycle. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when she left 3 years ago. But Elena knew that she was different. The war had changed her in ways that went deeper than the physical scars she carried. She had seen things that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. She had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. She had held the line when everything seemed hopeless and found victory in the face of overwhelming odds. And now she was home, in a place where none of that seemed to matter. The ground vehicle finally pulled up in front of a modest house with a white picket fence and a well-maintained garden. Elena paid the driver and shouldered her gear bag, walking slowly up the path to the front door. Before she could knock, the door opened and her mother appeared, her face lighting up with joy and relief. "Elena!" Sarah Vasquez wrapped her daughter in a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my baby, you're finally home. I was so worried about you out there." Elena hugged her mother back, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm home." Come in," Sarah said, pulling Elena into the house. "Your father's at the farm supply store, but he'll be back soon. Marcus is at the university, but he's driving down tonight to see you. Oh, I can't believe you're really here." The house smelled like fresh bread and the vanilla candles her mother loved. Everything was exactly as Elena remembered it. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the worn but comfortable furniture, the view of the fields through the kitchen window. It was home, and despite everything she had been through, it felt good to be back. But as she sat at the kitchen table and listened to her mother chatter about neighborhood news and family gossip, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was a stranger in her own home. 3 years of war had created a gulf between her and this peaceful civilian world that she wasn't sure how to bridge. Her mother poured her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, studying Elena's face with the concerned expression that only mothers could master. "You look tired, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, "and thinner than I remember. I hope they were feeding you properly out there." "The food was fine, Mom," Elena assured her. "Military rations aren't exactly gourmet, but they keep you going." "Well, you're home now, and I'm going to make sure you get some proper meals," Sarah declared. "Mrs. Henderson next door has been asking about you constantly. She's been telling everyone how proud the whole neighborhood should be to have a real military hero living right here in Millfield." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Henderson said that?" Sarah's expression became slightly uncomfortable. "Well, she's been very supportive. Some of the other neighbors, well, you know how people can be. They don't always understand what military service really means, especially for young women." Elena set down her coffee cup and looked directly at her mother. "What have they been saying, Mom?" Sarah fidgeted with her own cup, avoiding Elena's gaze. "It's nothing important, sweetheart. Just small-town gossip. You know how some people are old-fashioned in their thinking." "Mom," Elena said firmly, "what have they been saying?" Sarah sighed and finally met her daughter's eyes. "Some people think that, well, that the military probably kept you in a safe position because of your gender. They assume you were doing desk work or communications, something like that. Mrs. Patterson made some comments about how it's inappropriate for young ladies to be playing soldier when they should be thinking about marriage and family." Elena felt a familiar anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them they didn't know what they were talking about," Sarah said defensively. "I said my daughter was serving her planet with honor and dignity, and that they should be grateful for your sacrifice. But you know how people are. Once they get an idea in their heads." Elena nodded slowly. She had expected this, but it still stung to hear it confirmed. The war hero returning home to a world that couldn't accept what she had become. The front door opened, and Elena heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Her father appeared in the kitchen doorway, a tall man with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. Thomas Vasquez had been a good father, strict but fair, and Elena had always looked up to him. But now, as she stood to greet him, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Uncertainty, maybe even disappointment. "Elena," he said quietly, accepting her hug with less enthusiasm than she had hoped for. "Welcome home." "Thanks, Dad. It's good to see you." Thomas sat down at the table and accepted a cup of coffee from his wife. He studied Elena's uniform, taking in the medals and insignia with a farmer's attention to detail. "So," he said finally, 3 years in the military. I suppose they kept you busy." "They did," Elena replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Good, good," Thomas nodded. "Important to stay busy. Idle hands and all that." He paused, then looked directly at her. "I hope you learned some useful skills out there. Something practical that will help you when you, well, when you get back to normal life." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, Dad?" Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, the military's fine for a few years, I suppose. Good discipline, travel opportunities, all that. But eventually, a young woman needs to think about her future. Marriage, family, settling down. You're 26 now, Elena." That's not getting any younger." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stared at her father, trying to process what she was hearing. This was the man who had raised her to be strong and independent, who had taught her to stand up for herself and never back down from a challenge. And now he was suggesting that her 3 years of military service had been nothing more than an extended vacation before she settled into a traditional domestic role. "Dad," she said slowly, "I'm a captain in the Galactic Defense Force. I command a division of soldiers. I fought in major battles against alien enemies who were trying to destroy human civilization. I've saved thousands of lives and helped turn the tide of the war." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now, Elena, I know the military probably told you that you were doing important work, but let's be realistic here. They wouldn't have put you in any real danger. You're a young woman, not a soldier." Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Not a soldier," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Thomas," Sarah said nervously, "maybe we should—" "I'm just being practical," Thomas interrupted. "Elena's a smart girl, but she's also naive. The military probably filled her head with all sorts of stories about being a hero, but we know better. They would have kept her safe, away from the real fighting. It's just common sense." Elena looked back and forth between her parents, seeing the doubt in their eyes, the inability to accept that their daughter might have become something beyond their understanding. These were the people who were supposed to know her better than anyone, who were supposed to believe in her no matter what. And they couldn't see past her gender to recognize the warrior she had become. Without another word, Elena walked out of the kitchen, through the living room, and out the front door. She stood on the porch, breathing deeply in the cool evening air, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Behind her, she could hear her parents arguing in hushed tones, her mother defending her while her father insisted that they needed to be realistic about their daughter's future. Elena looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the war was still raging. Her soldiers were still fighting and dying, still holding the line against an enemy that would show no mercy if humanity failed. And here on Earth, in this peaceful farming community, people couldn't even imagine the reality of what was happening in their name. She thought about the men and women who had served under her command, who had followed her into battle without question because they trusted her judgment and her courage. She thought about the Catherian commander who had surrendered his ship to her personally, acknowledging her as a worthy opponent with a warrior's respect. But here, in her own home, with her own family, she was still just only a girl. Elena Vasquez, decorated war hero and seasoned combat veteran, stood alone on her childhood porch and realized that coming home might be the hardest battle she had ever fought. Elena spent the night in her old bedroom, staring at the ceiling she had memorized as a teenager. The walls were covered with academic achievement awards, science fair ribbons, and photos of her high school graduation. Everything from a different life, a different person. The girl who had earned those awards would never have believed she would one day hold a plasma rifle in combat or watch enemy ships explode in the vacuum of space. She had barely slept when morning came. And she could hear her parents moving around downstairs, their voices carrying the tension from the previous evening's conversation. Elena dressed in her civilian clothes, simple jeans and a sweater that made her look even younger than her 26 years, and made her way to the kitchen. Her mother had prepared an elaborate breakfast, clearly trying to smooth over the awkwardness from the night before. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said with forced cheerfulness. "I made all your favorites. Pancakes, eggs, that maple syrup you used to love." Thomas sat at the table with his coffee and the morning news feed on his tablet. He looked up when Elena entered, and she could see he was struggling with how to address what had happened. "Morning, Elena," he said quietly. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Elena replied, taking a seat across from him. The silence stretched uncomfortably until her mother filled the void with chatter about neighborhood news and plans for the day. "Mrs. Henderson wants to have a little welcome home gathering for you," Sarah said as she placed a plate of food in front of Elena. "Nothing too fancy, just some of the neighbors and family friends. She's very excited to hear about your experiences." Elena cut into her pancakes, remembering how much she had loved this breakfast as a child. Now it tasted like cardboard in her mouth. "That's kind of her, but I'm not sure I'm ready for a party." "Oh, but it would be good for you to get back into the community," Sarah insisted. "And it might help clear up some of the misunderstandings people have been having." Thomas looked up from his tablet. "What kind of misunderstandings?" Elena met her father's gaze directly. "The kind where people assume I spent 3 years filing paperwork and making coffee." The doorbell rang before Thomas could respond, and Sarah hurried to answer it. Elena could hear voices in the hallway, and then her mother returned with a middle-aged woman Elena recognized as Mrs. Patterson, one of their neighbors. "Elena!" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look at you, all grown up and back from your little military adventure. We're all so relieved you made it home safely." Elena stood politely, maintaining the courtesies her mother had taught her. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. It's good to see you again." Mrs. Patterson settled herself at the table without being invited, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "Now, you must tell us all about it. I'm sure they kept you nice and busy with administrative work. My cousin's daughter joined the military a few years back, and they had her doing communications. Very important work, and much more appropriate for young ladies. Actually," Elena said carefully, "I was in combat operations." Mrs. Patterson laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Oh dear, I'm sure that's what they called it, but we all know better. The military has to make everyone feel important, doesn't it? I'm sure you did wonderful work in whatever support role they assigned you." Elena felt her temper rising, but kept her voice level. "I commanded the 47th Orbital Strike Division. We were frontline combat troops." "Now, Elena," Mrs. Patterson said with a patronizing smile, "there's no need to exaggerate. We're all very proud of your service, but let's be realistic about what actually happened out there." Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Patterson, maybe we should—" "I fought in 17 major engagements," Elena continued, her voice growing harder. "I led boarding actions against enemy vessels. I earned the Silver Star for galactic service." Mrs. Patterson's expression became even more condescending. "Sweetheart, I understand that the military probably gave you some sort of participation award to make you feel special, but—" Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened slightly as she took in Elena's expression, something in the young woman's face finally penetrating her assumptions. "Mrs. Patterson," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room suddenly very aware of her presence. 3 months ago, I held the defense of Kepler Station against a Cytherian assault force that outnumbered us 3-1. 50,000 civilians were counting on my division to keep them alive. When our ammunition ran low, I personally led a boarding action against the enemy flagship. I fought my way through hostile aliens armed with weapons designed to kill humans, and I forced their surrender through superior tactics and sheer determination." The kitchen was dead silent. Mrs. Patterson's mouth had fallen open slightly, and Elena could see her parents staring at her as if seeing a stranger. "The Cytherians are 7 feet tall on average," Elena continued, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow filling the room with its intensity. "They have natural armor plating and strength that would let them tear a human apart with their bare hands. They showed no mercy to human prisoners, no respect for civilian populations, and no honor in combat. But they learned to fear the 47th Division, Because we never gave ground, and we never left our people behind. Elena moved closer to Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to shrink back in her chair. The enemy commander I captured told our intelligence officers that human females were particularly dangerous because they fought with a fury that defied all logic. He said that in his culture, warriors who showed such courage would be honored for generations. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice. I didn't realize, surely they wouldn't have put you in such danger. They put me where I was needed, Elena said simply, and I did what had to be done. Mrs. Patterson stood up quickly, her coffee cup rattling against the saucer. Well, I should be getting home. My husband will be wondering where I've gotten to. She headed for the door with unseemly haste, pausing only to add, It was educational talking with you, Elena. After Mrs. Patterson left, the kitchen remained silent for several minutes. Elena sat back down and tried to finish her breakfast, but she could feel her parents staring at her. Finally, her father spoke. Elena, he said slowly, is that really what happened out there? Elena looked up at him, seeing the beginning of understanding in his eyes. That, and worse, Dad. Much worse. Thomas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. We didn't know. The news reports never gave details about specific units or commanders. They just talked about the war in general terms. The military keeps operational details classified, Elena explained. For security reasons, the enemy monitors our communications networks. Sarah sat down heavily, her face pale. You were really in danger? Real danger. Every day, Elena confirmed. That's what war is, Mom. It's not a game or an adventure. It's people trying to kill you while you try to complete your mission and keep your soldiers alive. The front door opened again, and Elena heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. Elena's younger brother had grown taller during her absence, and his face had lost the last traces of boyhood. But his smile was exactly the same as she remembered. There's my big sister, the famous war hero, Marcus said, crossing the room to give Elena a fierce hug. Elena held him tightly, feeling tears threaten for the first time since she had arrived home. Marcus had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. I missed you, little brother, she whispered. I missed you too, Marcus replied, but I kept track of what you were doing out there. The university has access to classified military databases for research purposes. I know about the Silver Star, the commendations, the promotion recommendations from your superiors. Elena pulled back to look at him. You knew? Marcus nodded, his expression serious. I've been trying to tell Mom and Dad, but they wouldn't listen. They said I was just making things up to make them feel better. He looked at their parents, his voice taking on an edge Elena had never heard before. I told them you were a genuine hero, that you had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of the war. But they preferred to believe you were safe somewhere behind the lines, filing reports. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Son, You were being sexist, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. Elena came home decorated for valor, and your first assumption was that she must have been doing secretarial work. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Elena watched her father's face as he processed what Marcus had said, seeing the internal struggle between his traditional worldview and the evidence that was mounting against it. That's not, Thomas began, then stopped. I was trying to protect her. From what? Marcus demanded. From the truth? From the recognition she deserves? Elena is a war hero, Dad. A real one. She commanded soldiers in combat, made tactical decisions that saved civilian lives, and earned the respect of her enemies through her courage and skill. But you can't accept that, because she's your little girl. Elena put a hand on Marcus's arm. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I understand why it's hard to believe." "No, it's not okay," Marcus said firmly. "I've spent the last 3 years watching the news feeds, reading the military reports, trying to piece together what was really happening out there. Do you know what I found? I found records of battles where human forces were outnumbered 10-1 and somehow still won. I found after-action reports describing tactics so innovative that they're already being taught at military academies across the galaxy." Marcus turned to his parents, his voice rising with emotion. "I found a report describing how the 47th Orbital Strike Division held the line at Kepler Station for 18 hours against overwhelming odds, using improvised weapons and sheer determination to save 50,000 civilian lives. The commanding officer was specifically commended for extraordinary leadership under fire and tactical brilliance in the face of impossible circumstances." He pulled out his tablet and activated the display, projecting a document into the air above the kitchen table. Elena recognized the official seal of the Galactic Defense Force. "That commanding officer was Captain Elena Vasquez," Marcus continued, reading from the document. "Age 25 at the time of the action. Recommended for promotion to major and consideration for the Star of Terra, the highest decoration for valor in the face of enemy action." Elena stared at the document floating above the table. She had never seen the full text of the recommendation before. Such documents were usually classified until after the war ended. But there it was, in cold official language that somehow made her actions sound both more and less dramatic than they had felt at the time. Sarah was reading over the document, her face growing paler with each line. "The Star of Terra?" she whispered. "Elena, that's only given to the greatest heroes in human history." "I didn't get it," Elena said quietly. "The review board felt I was too young and inexperienced, but they did approve the promotion to major." Thomas was also reading the document, his expression changing as he processed the technical language describing Elena's tactical decisions and their outcomes. "It says here that your improvised defense saved not just Kepler Station, but prevented the enemy from capturing the mining equipment that produces the rare elements used in our ship armor." Elena nodded. "If the Catherians had captured those facilities, they could have analyzed our defensive technology and developed countermeasures. It would have extended the war by years and cost millions of lives." "And you figured this out in the middle of a battle?" Sarah asked. Her voice filled with wonder. "It's what commanders do," Elena replied. "You assess the situation, identify the critical factors, and make decisions based on incomplete information. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. That time, I was right." Marcus deactivated the tablet and set it aside. "There are dozens of reports like this. Elena's division has the highest success rate and lowest casualty figures of any unit in the Outer Rim theater. Her tactical innovations are already being integrated into standard doctrine. She's not just a war hero, she's one of the most effective military commanders of her generation." The kitchen fell silent again as the weight of this information settled over Elena's parents. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice subdued. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe it. Because I've spent my whole life in a place where people think women should be teachers and nurses and mothers, not soldiers and commanders. Because I was afraid that even my own family would assume I was exaggerating or making things up." "But the evidence," Thomas began, "is only convincing if you're willing to look at it objectively," Elena finished. "Mrs. Patterson just heard me describe my experiences in detail, and she still insisted I must be lying or confused. Some people will never accept that a young woman can be a warrior no matter what evidence you show them." Sarah reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have trusted you. I should have believed in you." Elena squeezed her mother's hand. You did what you thought was right. You were trying to protect me from disappointment, the same way Dad was. But I don't need protection anymore, Mom. I need understanding." Thomas cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "Elena, I owe you an apology. A big one. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I failed to see what you had become. You're not my little girl anymore. You're someone I'm not sure I even know." Elena met her father's eyes, seeing the genuine remorse there. "I'm still your daughter, Dad. That hasn't changed. But I'm also a soldier, a commander, and a veteran of the war that's been raging while you've been safe here on Earth. Those things are all part of who I am now." Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied with how the conversation was progressing. "There's something else you should know," he said to his parents. "Elena's been offered a position at the War College on Mars. They wanted to develop new training programs based on her combat experience." Elena shot him a surprised look. "How did you know about that?" "I still have friends in the military research division," Marcus replied with a grin. "They've been keeping track of your career. Apparently, there are some very important people who think Major Elena Vasquez has a bright future in military leadership." Thomas sat back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. "Major? I can't even... When I was your age, I was struggling to manage a 100-acre farm. You've been commanding thousands of soldiers in life-or-death situations." "It's a different world than the one you grew up in, Dad," Elena said gently. "The war changed everything. It forced humanity to use every resource we had, including women in combat roles. And it turned out that women could be just as effective as men, sometimes more so. Because we fight differently," Sarah said thoughtfully. "We use strategy instead of brute force." Elena nodded approvingly at her mother's insight. Exactly. The Catherians expected human males to fight like them, with aggression and overwhelming firepower. They weren't prepared for the tactical flexibility and creative thinking that human females brought to the battlefield. The doorbell rang again, interrupting their conversation. Sarah went to answer it, and Elena could hear multiple voices in the hallway. A few minutes later, her mother returned looking flustered. "It's Mrs. Henderson and several other neighbors," Sarah said nervously. "Word has gotten around about what happened with Mrs. Patterson. They want to talk to you." Elena stood up, straightening her sweater and checking her appearance. "I suppose it's time to face the music." Marcus stood as well. "Want some backup?" Elena smiled at her brother, feeling grateful for his support. "Thanks, but this is something I need to handle myself." She walked into the living room to find half a dozen neighbors seated awkwardly on the furniture, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. Mrs. Henderson stood as Elena entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Elena, dear," Mrs. Henderson said formally, "we've come to hear your side of things. There seem to be some conflicting stories going around about your military service." Elena looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze in turn. She recognized all of them. These were people she had known her entire life, people who had watched her grow up and who thought they knew exactly what kind of person she was supposed to be. "What would you like to know?" Elena asked politely. An older man named Mr. Collins leaned forward in his chair. "Well, for starters, we'd like to know if it's true that you claim to have been in combat, real combat, against aliens." Elena felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, the same emotional detachment that had kept her alive during the war. "I don't claim anything, Mr. Collins. I commanded the 47th Orbital Strike Division for 3 years. We were a frontline combat unit assigned to the Outer Rim Theater." "But surely," a woman named Mrs. Kim interjected, "they wouldn't have put you in actual danger. You're just a..." "Girl," Elena finished quietly. "Yes, I know. Everyone keeps reminding me of that fact." The room fell silent, and Elena could feel the tension building. These people had come here expecting to debunk what they saw as an outrageous story, to put a presumptuous young woman back in her proper place. They weren't prepared for the quiet confidence in Elena's voice or the steady way she met their skeptical stares. "Mr. Collins," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "3 weeks ago, I received a personal commendation from Fleet Admiral Morrison for my role in breaking the siege of New Tokyo. The commendation specifically mentions my tactical innovations and personal courage under fire. Would you like to see it?" Mr. Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone can fake a document. The commendation is logged in the official military database," Elena interrupted. "You can verify it through any public terminal. My service record is a matter of public information, including my combat decorations and promotion history." Mrs. Kim spoke up again. "But even if that's true, surely you weren't actually fighting. You were probably coordinating from a safe distance." Elena pulled up the sleeve of her sweater, revealing a long scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The skin was pale and twisted, where plasma fire had burned through her combat armor. "This is from a Catherian energy weapon," she said matter-of-factly. "I received it during hand-to-hand combat aboard an enemy vessel. Would you like to see the others?" The neighbors stared at the scar in shocked silence. It was ugly, obviously the result of serious injury, and it gave physical proof to Elena's claims that was impossible to dismiss. Mrs. Henderson found her voice first. "Elena, we had no idea." "No," Elena agreed. "You had no idea because you didn't want to know. It's easier to assume that the military kept me safe, that my service was just playing dress-up for 3 years. It's more comfortable to believe that than to accept that your neighbor's daughter became a killer." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Elena had said it deliberately, knowing the effect it would have. These people needed to understand what war really meant, what she had really become. "I've killed enemy soldiers, Mrs. Henderson," Elena continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "I've watched my own soldiers die under my command. I've made decisions that resulted in the deaths of thousands of beings, human and alien alike. That's what war is. That's what I've spent 3 years doing while you've been safe here on Earth, growing crops and raising families and pretending that the universe is a peaceful place." Mr. Collins stood up abruptly. "Now see here, young lady. We don't have to listen to this kind of talk." "You're right," Elena said, standing as well. "You don't have to listen to anything. You can go back to your comfortable homes and your comfortable assumptions and pretend that I never came back to disturb your peace. But the war is still happening, Mr. Collins. The Catherians are still out there, still trying to destroy human civilization. And there are still young men and women dying in space to keep you safe, including some who aren't much older than I was when I left." Elena looked around the room one more time, seeing the mixture of shock, fear, and dawning understanding on the faces of her neighbors. "I came home because I wanted to see my family and the place where I grew up, but I'm beginning to realize that home isn't really here anymore. Home is with the people who understand what I've become and what I've sacrificed." Without another word, Elena walked out of the living room, through the kitchen where her family was waiting anxiously, and out the back door into the garden where she had played as a child. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the distant hum of agricultural machinery working the fields. But for the first time since she had returned to Earth, Elena was beginning to understand that coming home might not be the ending she had hoped for. It might just be the beginning of a different kind of battle. Elena stood in the garden for nearly an hour, watching the sun move across the sky and thinking about her future. The peaceful countryside that had once felt like paradise now seemed almost alien to her. The silence was wrong. There should be the hum of ship engines, the chatter of military communications, the constant background awareness that danger could appear at any moment. She was still standing there when Marcus found her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of concern. "The neighbors left," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Mom and Dad are inside trying to process everything that just happened." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully and took a sip before responding. "I probably shouldn't have been so harsh with them." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But they needed to hear it. People here have been living in a bubble, Elena. The war feels like something happening on the other side of the galaxy, not a real threat that could affect their lives." Elena turned to study her brother's face. "You're different too. More serious than I remembered." Marcus smiled ruefully. "I've spent 3 years researching military technology and tactics, trying to understand what you were going through out there. It changes your perspective when you realize how close we came to losing everything." "How close?" Elena asked. "Closer than the government admits publicly," Marcus replied grimly. "If the Catherians had captured the rare element mines at Kepler Station, they would have gained a decisive technological advantage. The war would have been over within 6 months, and humanity would have been extinct within a year." Elena stared at him, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. "They never told us it was that critical." "They wouldn't," Marcus said. "Operational security. But I've seen the classified analyses. Your division's actions at Kepler Station didn't just win a battle, Elena. They saved our species." The weight of that revelation settled over Elena like a physical force. She had known that Kepler Station was important, but she had never realized the full scope of what failure would have meant. 50,000 civilian lives had been just the beginning. The real stakes had been the survival of humanity itself. "No wonder they wanted to give you the Star of Terra," Marcus continued. "You didn't just perform above and beyond the call of duty. You literally saved human civilization." Elena set down her coffee cup and sat heavily on the garden bench where she used to read as a teenager. "I was just doing my job, Marcus. I saw a tactical situation and responded to it. I didn't think about the larger implications." "That's what made you so effective," Marcus replied, sitting beside her. "You weren't paralyzed by the magnitude of what was at stake. You just focused on the immediate problem and solved it." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the agricultural machines move through the distant fields. Finally, Elena spoke again. "I got a message from Fleet Command yesterday. They want me to accept the promotion to Major and take command of a new experimental division. Cutting-edge technology, hand-picked personnel, unlimited resources." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is," Elena agreed. "But it also means going back out there, back to the war zone. And I'm not sure I'm ready to leave Earth again so soon." "Because of the reception you've received here?" Elena shook her head. "Because I'm starting to understand that there's another war that needs to be fought, right here, on the home front." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, they heard voices from the front of the house. Elena recognized one of them and felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "That's Colonel Harrison," she said, standing up quickly. "My former commanding officer. What's he doing here?" Marcus stood as well, his expression concerned. "Maybe we should go find out." They walked around the house to find a military transport parked in the driveway, its official markings clearly visible to anyone in the neighborhood. Colonel Harrison stood on the front porch talking with Elena's parents, his dress uniform immaculate despite the long journey from the spaceport. "Elena," Harrison said as she approached, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "It's good to see you, Major." Elena snapped to attention automatically. "Sir, I wasn't expecting you." Harrison waved her to ease. "This is an unofficial visit. I happened to be on Earth for meetings with Fleet Command, and I wanted to check on my best former division commander." His expression became more serious. "I also heard you might be having some readjustment issues." Elena glanced at her parents, wondering what they had told him. "Nothing I can't handle, sir." "I'm sure you can," Harrison replied, but I thought you might benefit from hearing about something that happened after you left the front lines." Elena's curiosity was piqued. "Sir?" Harrison activated a small hollow projector, displaying an image of a sleek alien vessel unlike any Elena had seen before. "This is a Catherian diplomatic ship. It arrived at fleet headquarters 2 weeks ago, carrying an ambassador with a very interesting message." Elena stared at the ship, noting its unmarked hull and peaceful configuration. "Diplomatic contact? That's the first time in the entire war." "The first and only time," Harrison confirmed. "The ambassador requested a meeting with specific human military commanders. Guess whose name was at the top of the list?" Elena felt her heart rate increase. "Mine?" "Major Elena Vasquez, commander of the 47th Orbital Strike Division," Harrison said formally. "The Catherian Empire specifically requested to negotiate with the human female who had defeated their forces at Kepler Station." Sarah gasped audibly, and Thomas took a step closer to hear better. Marcus was grinning with obvious pride, but Elena felt only confusion. "Sir, I don't understand. Why would they want to negotiate with me specifically?" Harrison deactivated the projector and looked directly at Elena. "Because you've become something of a legend among their warrior caste. The enemy commander you captured at Kepler Station has been telling stories about the small human female who fought with the fury of their greatest heroes. According to our intelligence sources, some Catherian military units have started using your tactical innovations in their own operations." Elena's mouth fell open slightly. "They're copying my tactics?" "With great success, apparently," Harrison confirmed. "The ambassador told us that your reputation among their people is so significant that they believe you might be the key to ending this war." Thomas stepped forward, his farmer's practicality overcoming his shock. "Ending the war? How?" Harrison turned to address Elena's family. "The Catherians have a warrior culture that places great value on courage and tactical skill. They've been fighting this war because they see humans as weak and unworthy of respect. But Major Vasquez changed that perception. She proved that humans could be formidable opponents worthy of honorable treatment." Elena was struggling to process this information. "So they want to negotiate because I beat them?" "Because you beat them with honor," Harrison corrected. "According to the ambassador, the way you treated captured enemy personnel and protected civilian populations during combat operations demonstrated that humans possess the warrior virtues that Catherian culture respects." Marcus laughed out loud, drawing startled looks from everyone present. "I'm sorry," he said, still grinning. "It's just that Elena has been dealing with people here who think she was filing paperwork for 3 years, and meanwhile she's become so famous among the enemy that they want her to negotiate the end of the war." The irony was not lost on Elena. She had come home to find that her own neighbors couldn't accept her as a warrior, while the aliens she had been fighting respected her enough to request her specifically for diplomatic talks. "What do they want from me?" Elena asked. Harrison's expression became very serious. "They want you to lead a joint human Catherian commission to establish rules of engagement for future conflicts. They're proposing what amounts to a warrior's code that both species can accept." Elena stared at him in amazement. "They want to end the war by establishing honor rules for how we fight each other?" "Not end it exactly," Harrison clarified, "but transform it from a war of extermination into something more like competitive trials, contests between warrior cultures to determine territorial rights and resource allocation." Sarah spoke up nervously. "But that means the fighting would continue." "On a much smaller scale," Harrison assured her. "Specific challenges with agreed-upon stakes rather than the total warfare we've been engaged in. It would save millions of lives on both sides." Elena walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the peaceful farmland, trying to imagine a future where humans and Catherians competed rather than tried to destroy each other. It seemed almost too good to be true. What does Fleet Command think of this proposal? They're cautiously optimistic, Harrison replied. The Cytherians have already implemented a ceasefire in 3 sectors as a gesture of good faith. Civilian shipping has resumed in those areas for the first time in 4 years. Elena turned back to face him. And they specifically requested me for these negotiations? By name and rank, Harrison confirmed. The ambassador made it clear that they would only proceed if Major Elena Vasquez was part of the commission. They view you as the human who best understands their concept of honorable warfare. Thomas stepped forward, his expression troubled. This sounds very dangerous, Elena. You'd be putting yourself at risk again. Elena looked at her father, seeing the concern in his eyes, and realized that something fundamental had changed between them. Yesterday, he had seen her as his little girl who needed to be protected. Today, he was addressing her as an adult who was capable of making her own decisions about serious matters. All diplomatic work carries risks, Dad, Elena said gently. But this could be the opportunity to save countless lives on both sides. More than that, Marcus added excitedly, this could be the beginning of a completely new kind of relationship between humans and alien species. Think about the implications for trade, technology exchange, exploration. Harrison nodded approvingly. Your brother understands the larger picture. This isn't just about ending the current conflict. It's about establishing humanity's place in a galaxy where multiple intelligent species need to coexist. Elena felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. These were the kinds of decisions that would affect the future of human civilization, and somehow she had found herself at the center of them. When do they need an answer? The commission is scheduled to convene in 6 weeks, Harrison replied. The meetings will be held on a neutral space station in the Epsilon sector. If you accept, you'd need to report for briefings and preparation within 2 weeks. Elena looked at her family, seeing the mixture of pride and worry on their faces. Yesterday, they had been trying to convince her to settle down and start thinking about marriage and children. Today, they were learning that alien diplomats considered her essential to intergalactic peace negotiations. There's something else you should know, Harrison continued. The Cytherian ambassador specifically mentioned that they were impressed by your courage in returning to a society that didn't understand or appreciate your sacrifices. They view it as another example of the kind of warrior virtue they respect. Elena raised an eyebrow. They know about my reception here? They monitor our communications networks, Harrison said matter-of-factly. They've been tracking public opinion about returning veterans, particularly female combat personnel. The ambassador expressed disappointment in how human civilian populations have been treating their warriors. The implications of this hit Elena like a physical blow. The enemy had been watching and judging not just her military performance, but how human society treated its defenders, and they had found human civilian attitudes lacking. Sir, Elena said slowly, are you saying that part of the reason the Cytherians were willing to negotiate was because they felt sorry for how I was being treated at home? Harrison's expression became uncomfortable. The ambassador did mention that Cytherian society honors its warriors regardless of gender, and that they found human attitudes primitive. Elena felt a flush of shame that had nothing to do with her own actions. Her own species was being judged as backward by their enemies because of how they treated their female veterans. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of the yard, having obviously been watching the proceedings from her own house. She approached nervously, clearly curious about the military transport and the officer in dress uniform. Elena, dear, Mrs. Henderson said hesitantly, is everything all right? We couldn't help but notice the official vehicle. Elena looked at the older woman, remembering her dismissive attitude just a few hours earlier. Then she looked back at Colonel Harrison, at her family, and at the decision that lay before her. Mrs. Henderson, Elena said clearly, I'd like you to meet Colonel Harrison, my former commanding officer. He's here to offer me a position as humanity's chief representative in diplomatic negotiations to end the war. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. Diplomatic negotiations? You mean, the enemy specifically requested me by name, Elena continued. They want me to help establish new rules for human-alien relations based on the military reputation I earned during my 3 years of combat service. The color drained from Mrs. Henderson's face as the full implications hit her. The young woman she had been dismissing as a pretender was being sought out by alien governments as a key figure in intergalactic diplomacy. I had no idea, Mrs. Henderson stammered. No, Elena agreed quietly. You had no idea. But that's going to change, Mrs. Henderson, because if I accept this position, people are going to have to start understanding what the women and men who fought this war really accomplished out there. Elena turned back to Colonel Harrison, her decision crystallizing in her mind. Sir, I accept the position. When do I report for duty? Harrison smiled broadly. Outstanding. Major. Transport leaves for Fleet Headquarters in 48 hours. You'll need to pack for extended deployment and prepare for the most important diplomatic mission in human history. Elena nodded, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with accepting a difficult assignment. Yes, sir. I'll be ready. As Harrison prepared to leave, Elena's parents approached her with expressions of mixed pride and concern. Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Sarah asked. It sounds incredibly dangerous. Elena hugged her mother gently. Mom, everything worthwhile is dangerous. But this is what I was trained for, what I'm good at. And apparently, I'm the only human the Catherians trust enough to negotiate with. Thomas extended his hand to Elena, his calloused farmer's grip firm and respectful. Elena, I owe you another apology. I spent so much time worrying about protecting you that I never stopped to consider that you might be the one protecting all of us. Elena shook her father's hand, noting the new respect in his eyes. That's what soldiers do, Dad. We stand between our families and the things that would hurt them, even when our families don't understand what we're fighting. Marcus stepped forward and gave Elena another fierce hug. I'm proud of you, sis. Not just for what you accomplished in the war, but for coming home and facing people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. Elena held her brother tightly, realizing that his support had been what made it possible for her to endure the last few days. Thank you for believing in me when no one else would. As the military transport pulled away from the house, Elena stood on the porch with her family and watched the neighbors gathering in their yards to stare and whisper. Word would spread quickly through Millfield that Elena Vasquez, the girl they had dismissed as a pretender, was actually a diplomatic envoy to an alien government. Elena, Sarah said quietly, what's going to happen now? With the negotiations, I mean. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know, Mom, but for the first time since this war started, there's a real chance for peace. And somehow, I get to be part of making that happen. Elena looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the evening sky, thinking about the aliens out there who respected her courage and skill enough to request her by name. She thought about the thousands of human soldiers who were still fighting and dying while she stood safely on Earth. And she thought about the future that might be possible if courage and honor could triumph over fear and prejudice. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the most important mission of her life. She would represent humanity in negotiations that could reshape the entire galaxy. But tonight, she was simply Elena Vasquez, standing in her family's garden, and finally understanding that home wasn't a place you returned to unchanged. Home was something you carried with you, something that grew stronger every time you stood up for what you believed in. Every time you refused to let other people's limitations define who you could become. Elena Vasquez had come home a seasoned warrior, and despite everything she had faced, despite the people who still insisted on seeing her as only a girl. She was beginning to realize that her greatest battles still lay ahead. The war had forged her into a weapon, but peace would require something even more difficult to become. A bridge between worlds, a translator between species, a living symbol of what humanity could achieve when it refused to be limited by tradition and fear. As she stood there in the growing darkness, Elena smiled for the first time since coming home. The girl who had left Millfield 3 years ago really was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had been tested by fire and proven worthy of respect from both her allies and her enemies. And that person was ready for whatever came next. Elena looked at her family one more time, seeing the pride and understanding finally shining in their eyes. "I love you all," she said simply, "and I promise you this. When I come home again, it will be to a galaxy where daughters can be warriors, where women can command respect through their courage and skill, and where no one will ever again dismiss someone's achievements because of their gender." Sarah wiped away a tear and smiled at her daughter. "We'll be waiting for you, sweetheart, however long it takes." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose combining into something that felt like destiny. She had fought one war to save human civilization. Now she would fight another to help it grow into something worthy of the galaxy it was destined to inherit. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. This time, she would be fighting for a future where every human being could achieve their full potential, regardless of what other people expected them to be. The stars wheeled overhead, and Elena Vasquez, major in the Galactic Defense Force and humanity's newest diplomatic envoy, began planning her next campaign.